Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Asmogan and today I'm going to be doing an off-the-cuff review of Stormblood. While it's still somewhat fresh in my memory, even though I'm a little bit over or exactly halfway through Shadowbringers. It's taken me a hot minute to get to this review. I had to really process my thoughts, and I think I have everything all my ducks in a row. So without further ado, let's just get into my overall thoughts about the Stormblood expansion and its post-patch content. So, first off, let's start with the Stormblood story in this review. Now, when it came to this story, this is probably where my opinion is the most of a mixed bag. Now, what I will say for like a summary off the get-go before I go into like detail is, overall, I think the story is very, very good. It's very, very strong, while at the same time having a lot of specific weak points that weigh the whole thing down overall. It's an interesting dichotomy. It mainly comes between the overarching story and then the individual smaller scale stories within the overarching story. There's a bit of a constant changing of the scales on like the weight of certain quests and characters, and it's really hard to narrow down overall, but I think I can do it. So let's just start at the beginning. The expansion started incredibly strong. Like, we're heading into Alamigo, we're going to aid the resistance, we're going to fight back against the Empire, we're really going to take the fight to this long-standing enemy of ours here in Eorzea, and in the entirety of the world that we are entering. And it seemed pretty solid. Like, we were doing what felt like espionage missions, we were going behind enemy lines, we were meeting up with locals and trying to stir up rebellion. We saw the dire straits everyone was in. It was very, very strong. And at Rhalgr's Reach, when it was sieged by Xenos, we then met a very solid villain. And I want to make this entirely clear. Xenos is actually not my favorite villain as of right now, but he was until I got to Shadowbringers. I got to say, he reminds me a lot of Darth Vader. He's very imposing, very strong. He likes to fight himself on the front line. He likes to be there in the trenches and fighting. Not because necessarily he wants to fight with his men and he finds it a better position optically. He just likes to fight. He's a warrior. He's a bit of a psychopath, but he's a warrior nonetheless. Like Darth Vader, he kills those underneath his position who don't exactly live up to the expectations he has set. He values meritocracy. He couldn't give two shits where you were born, as long as you are somewhat capable in your position. And if you are more capable than your superior officer, then your superior officer gets to see himself out, and you get a promotion. It's the kind of villain that I like. I really love villains that are, again, strong, badass, super imposing, and just really define themselves as strong warriors. I don't really like the conniving Grima Wormtongue type villains who are in the background manipulating stuff. Those are the type of villains that I hate on a fundamental level, not only as characters, but as on a writing level. I just don't enjoy those kinds of villains. They're not villains I would ever be happy about facing. They're not villains I can see myself relating to in any other kind of scenario. So overall, I just hate the conniving kind of villains. So Xenos is, in my opinion, a really strong villain. Even though, again, he's a simple villain. His motivations are simple, the way he operates is simple, but in a way, that simplicity provides a level of complexity in how and overall how he interacts with the world he's in. Now, what I will say is, with that introduction with him at Rhalgr's Reach, where he just viciously slaughters everyone, and even defeats us, which canonically, as far as I can think, there's no villain just by themselves, especially a human one, that just defeated us like that. It was amazing, and one hell of a way to establish the stakes. And also give us the gravity of the overall situation we are going into with the entirety of the rest of the expansion. And he even caused us to retreat back to a more fortified position and pretty much give up Rhalgr's Reach. And he did it without actually destroying Rhalgr's Reach and killing everyone there. He just bailed because he achieved what he wanted. He wanted to rile us up. He wanted to create he wanted to create a effective fighting force to properly challenge him, to scratch that itch, if you will, of his desire for a proper challenge, which I kind of made a joke in my back of my head. I'm like, he's like evil Goku in the wanting to fight stronger villains. But yeah, that was such an amazing, strong start to an expansion, and I really got to praise it. And at that particular juncture, I was like, wow, how could people say this is not as good as Heavensward? This feels like a pretty damn faithful follow-up. Then we went to Doma. Now, I'm going to say this. My favorite part of the expansion took place in the Far East. The Doma, Azim Steppe, Kugane. All of that was very enjoyable. All of that was incredibly good. I liked the quest lines, and I think all that came together very well. And those are probably my favorite zones in the entire expansion. The problem is when you quest in that zone, when you help the Doman resistance take back Doma. You then, where the problem really comes in is when you're done helping the rebellion, when you're done aiding them in battle, when you're done the entire arc that takes place in Doma. And there's some amazing characters over there. I loved Hien, Gosetsu, Yugiri. I love these characters a lot, and they were very enjoyable, and I really felt I wanted to aid them in battle. The big problem came was when we finished all that up, and I felt like that arc was so well done, so well completed, so succinct. And then we returned back to Alamigo. Now, for me, that kind of I felt a bit of plot whiplash with that. Like, when we returned back to Alamigo, I felt like we just started over. It's like, didn't we just do this song and dance in Doma? Like, didn't we just help a resistance defeat the Empire and push them out, and then we all celebrate, yay, we won? Didn't we do this exact song and dance just a little while ago? It was a lot of whiplash for me. I wish that it had been handled differently. Thankfully, I still don't find this entirely terrible, bad, or no, not even remotely bad writing, bad experience overall in the story. I don't think any of that whiplash I would describe as bad or bad writing or bad experience. If you want to know bad narrative experience, go play WoW. I'll just put it like that. Go play WoW. You want to know a terrible narrative experience in a video game? Go play WoW. Any of the expansions after Wrath, go play WoW. But in FF, it's still an amazing story, but I could definitely see why people think Stormblood is not the strongest follow-up. Is not the coming off Heavensward, I think, is what hurts the story in particular the most in Stormblood. Coming off of Heavensward, it does really hurt it, because with all the amazing characters, with all the amazing arcs that took place over the entirety of Heavensward's story and its post-patch content with the Dragonsong War, there was just so much meaty goodness there, not only with the individual characters, but also with the overall story. And with Stormblood, I don't think so. But when we got back to, when we defeated Yotsuyu, who is a villain I don't like that type of villain as I just described, but the post-patch content stuff she did grow on me a little bit more, but I still find that she did need to die to pay for her sins. I do mourn the loss of Suyu, but Yotsuyu did deserve to die. Now, in the case of us going back to Alamigo, though, away from the really solid, in my opinion, the most enjoyable questing story section, which was Doma, to go back to Alamigo after that was the whiplash. And with the arc that took place there, I can't really say that most of the questing that was done towards the actual proper Alamigan Resistance arc felt good. Like, a lot of it felt like chores, a lot of it felt like running around just doing the same stuff we just did. The only part that was really, really good was when we actually finally faced Xenos. Like, I feel like we should have just come back to Alamigo, and yes, narratively it wouldn't have made a lot of sense if we just immediately went and sieged the Alamigan capital. but it really I felt like they could have just been a little bit better with the questing leading up to that final battle with Xenos. It's not terrible, it's not bad, it's just it wasn't as strong as Doma, I felt. Doma had a stronger questing and narrative experience by comparison, so it definitely hurt the my overall take on the story of Stormblood pretty strongly. It's really hard to put into words. The only other thing I'll note about the story, well, first let me talk about the ending. The ending I thought was really solid. Like when our final battle with Xenos, him merging or taking over Shinryu, us fighting. I died several times during that fight. I felt really bad. As a tank, I was just getting wrecked, and very few other people in that trial were getting as wrecked as I was. So, but I liked the battle, and the way Xenos seemed to take himself out, like all of that was like, damn. And then the actual proper ending in the patch content leading into Shadowbringers, where we faced off with the Ascian who had taken over Xenos' body. We're in that giant battle zone, like I'll get into on its own. I think the patch content deserves its own little section here, so I'm really focusing on 4.0 overall. But with that ending, with Xenos cutting his throat, and then the flag being hoisted, and everything seeming fairly well wrapped up, the 4.0 ended on a high note, I think. It's just, again, that questing in Alamigo and finishing up with their resistance, it felt like we recycled the exact same plot we just went through with Doma. But yeah, with the post-patch content, the only thing I have to say is it's amazing. I love the post-patch story. I really don't know how else to phrase it. Like, I could go into specifics, but I just really liked the Ascian stole Xenos' body. I like that it's confirmed that Xenos is basically still alive, and he's hopping body to body. I like everything that is set up in the patch content, because it felt like a perfect flow into Shadowbringers for me. So, and also just that like impact of each of the Scions one by one, all falling and losing consciousness, and their souls seemingly sucked out, and not knowing what's doing it. I thought it was Zodiark at first, and I loved the patch content. I just gotta put it there. The post Stormblood patches are a 9.5 out of 10 for me, and if I can do half points, if I have to do solid 10s, I'd say it's right there at 10. Like, in my opinion, it's the perfect prologue for Shadowbringers. But the core 4.0 experience was more of a 7 out of 10, 7 out of 10, 6 out of 10. For me personally, it was good, it's strong, it's just, it had a massive misfortune of following up Heaven's Ward. And in terms of individual characters, I thought Lise was a very weak main protagonist outside of ourselves. I just felt like they just didn't do enough to set her up and develop her and really make it so she earned that spotlight for Stormblood. I would have preferred if it had been Roban we were focusing on that entire time, but he got a little bit of focus anyway in the post Stormblood patches, which I liked. I just wish he had been the kind of main central character for the Alamegan Resistance. But it's not a huge problem. Lisa's voice lines are very well voice acted. I thought that the narrative did the best that it could with the minimal setup for her to be the spotlight character. I think it did the best that it could and with what it had, and I think she was still solid overall. Just could have used with a little bit more time in the oven before we went to Alamigo and before we started Stormblood. But, you know, it's still good. It's still good. I just don't want to stress that. So, yeah, I think that's a good way to sum up my thoughts about the story. It's very, very good. It's a very solid narrative. The only problem is when you put a magnifying glass, you're going to start seeing its more overt, glaring imperfections. And there is one overarching glaring imperfection, which is in the whiplash of the story, with basically recycling the same exact idea with Doma, and in their resistance and taking back their home, and with Alamigo doing the same thing. I felt like there really needed to be something between the two that really made them feel entirely removed from one another, but it felt like a copy-paste scenario to me, personally. But, yep, overall, that's my thoughts of the Stormblood story. Now let's get on to the zones. Stormblood zones. So when it comes to the zones in Stormblood, I actually... my thoughts are pretty flat about this one. I loved the Doma zone. I loved all the Far East zones. I loved Kugane. Kugane was very like the music that plays, like when you're in a city, the aesthetic. It's so beautiful and striking. I just loved it. Like I honestly, it's one of those things where I love Ishgard is like reminds me of my actual home in real life. Like it's very snowy, very dark a lot of the time, but that for me provides comfort. It makes me think of a warm fire in the cold of winter. It makes me think of hot chocolate. It makes me think like Ishgard is my home. I definitely and like my character's home in the game is Limsa, but if there's a third location that's in the running to be like the place where I would want to live in this universe, it would be Kugane. It looked so beautiful. The Ruby Sea, yeah, I could take it or leave it. There's a lot of traversal there. I like the underwater sections a lot more, weirdly enough, than the island hopping situation with the Ruby Sea. So yeah, the Confederacy is also kind of a weird faction. Not bad, but I don't know. I don't exactly know what my thoughts are on them specifically. I don't dislike them. I don't hate them. Like it's weird, but yeah, that's a decent zone. I liked a lot of the questing in there. It's just definitely probably the weakest Far East zone is probably the Ruby Sea. The Azim Steppe. Oh, I loved the Azim Steppe. It's really hard to pull. It's such a simple zone, like aesthetically. It's not like. It doesn't have all these glowy bits shooting out of the ground. It's not this overly fantastical zone. It's not got all these weirdly colored plants. But in the kind of like, I feel like this could be a real place you would see and visit in the real world. In the big, giant, large, I'm not sure what it's called, the plateau that the sun dudes, the sun Ara live on. That seemed really cool when you go on top of it and you kind of like look out across the rest of the Azim Steppe. It's a really striking, very identifiable landmark that I really liked. And when it came to the questing in the Azim Steppe, I kind of find that the most fun. The rest of the expansion, you know, you can kind of argue narratively is this that way, but I would say like fun factor, like just kind of the unintentional or intentional comedy with the characters, the learning of certain characters' backstory, like we found out Hien's childhood name, well, learning, meeting new characters, seeing how they interact with one another, and the funny setup of kind of I think it was unintentional, but at the same time intentional comedy with the head sun dude who was hunting for his moon, and he's basically just like every girl that's just like, kind of hits his fancy, like, are you my moon? And he's like super aggressive about it. I don't know, everything was just so much fun in the Azim Steppe for questing, and again the zone itself in its simplicity also felt like really warm, felt really welcoming, and I really liked it overall. I really did. Yansha, or you know, the core Doma area itself, I really liked that too. Like I loved the aesthetic, kind of like the Great Wall of China kind of feel there, that with it being completely destroyed in a couple sections, very easy to recognize this large opening where there was a field early in questing, and then it gets removed after you go through the narrative of the zone. It's got a lot in it that's just beautiful, and I think really well done as well. Like this, the design of Yangsha is really good, and I really don't know how else to put it. Like, it's just good. I love it. It's awesome, and it's not in its fantastical elements that make that zone feel so nice. It's both in the music that plays in the background, but it's also It's also in kind of the real world kind of derivative elements that make it feel all grand and relatable. So I really liked the Far East zones. But the dichotomy to that, or I guess the opposite side of the coin of that, is the Alamegan zones. Now, for me personally, I was very unimpressed, or I was very underwhelmed with the Alamegan zones. Now, a part of that is they're intended to be a very active, very savage war zone, and it is a zone that is not that far removed from Ul'dah, so it's also a desert area. But my problem is it didn't do a lot to differentiate itself from Ul'dah to me. Like, I felt like I was still in Thanalan. I felt like I didn't feel like I left Thanalan at all when we were in Alamigo. It was only a couple times in very, very specific areas in the Alamegan zones that kind of felt different from Thanalan, or someplace I would feel like I would see just traversing Ul'dah. I was just unimpressed. I don't even really remember all the individual names for the zones in Alamigo. Like, that's just how much I just didn't really connect with it at all. Yeah, I'm sorry to say, like, if there's people out there who really love the Alamegan zones, that's totally cool, but for me, it just felt like another shade of Ul'dah. Or another shade of Thanalan, I should say. I don't know, I was just unimpressed with them. Like, not my aesthetic, I suppose. Overall, I think for leveling experience, for questing, I would say, and for aesthetic, I would say that the Far East zones, for the most part, are all of them within, like, the 9 out of 10 range. For, like, my overall thoughts, you would put them numerically. I'd say 9 out of 10. Very solid Far East zones. The Alamegan zones, 6 out of 10. 6 out of 10 for me. I was not super impressed. The aesthetic really needed to be brought up another notch to feel different from Ul'dah, or feel different from Thanalan. I didn't feel like I left Thanalan. So yeah, that's my thoughts of the new zones in Stormblood. Although they're not new now, obviously, but new if you're going into the expansion. That's my thoughts. So, dungeons and trials. This is where I have this is probably going to be my shortest thoughts in the overall review, because there's not a lot to say. Overall, I'd say the dungeons were very solid for the most part, mechanically, aesthetically. Some were pretty interesting, but no, not a lot of standouts. I'm gonna be perfectly honest. Not a lot of standouts, with the exception, although it's a trial, so it's not a... So dungeon-wise, there's really no dungeon that felt like it stood out very well, except Doma Castle. That's probably about the only one that really, for me personally, that really stood out amongst the crowd of the overall Stormblood dungeons. Otherwise, dungeon-wise, both narratively, mechanically, aesthetically, not a lot of standouts except for Doma Castle. Doma Castle felt pretty cool, but that was mostly because of the narrative wrap-up of the Doma arc with the Resistance. It felt very notable. So, and with defeating Yotsuyu, who was a very despicable, very unlikable villain. And ironically, the only other the only trial that I really like. Well, there's two. Okay, I'll admit there's two. In 4.0, the only trial that stood out that was really good was when we faced Shinryu Xenos, or Xenos Shinryu, whatever you want to refer to it. That was the only one that really stood out to me, and not only because it kicked my ass, like, again, I died 3 times. We didn't wipe, thankfully, but I personally, during that trial, died like 3 times. And it was very frustrating. The way that one, both narratively, was sewn in, and also the grand nature of fighting Shinryu was really, like, it really built up well, and I liked facing it, and the mechanics of that trial I thought were fun, and I feel like if I had known them going in, I probably wouldn't have died as many times, but it was still good, it was still fun, and I really liked that trial. But I think the best trial in Stormblood across the board would be in the, again, this is a consistent trend, the best Stormblood content, ironically, isn't actually in core Stormblood. It's in the Legend Returns arc of the post-Stormblood patches, which I consider more of a prologue to Shadowbringers than I do an epilogue to Stormblood. But yes, I think you all know the trial I'm going to be referring to, the trial of Castrum Fluminus. Or Fluminus, I still don't know how to say that. But that Castrum, you all know the one when we face off with Yotsuyu, where she gets a revenge against her shit stain of a brother Asahi. That arc is wrapped up. The tragedy of the loss of Tsuyu, the tragedy with Gosetsu and seeing his daughter in Tsuyu, and the what could have been kind of vibe that you get from her narrative. It was such a beautiful wrap up, and I really, really loved it. And it's probably the only time in Stormblood overall that I felt my emotions were starting to be affected. It didn't get to me. I didn't cry. I felt Yotsuyu had established herself as such a bad, evil person that despite Tsuyu's innocence, despite Tsuyu's goodness, Yotsuyu got the fate that she had earned, that she deserved, and she got it in the best way possible. Instead of a public execution with people staring and glaring and hating her, she got to go out her way. She died at the hands of her brother, but she also got to die getting her most meaningful revenge to herself, while also again paying her debt to society, to the society that she had ravaged and reaved for so long. I definitely feel that she deserved to die. She had earned that in spades, but she went out the best way she could have for herself. So the Castrum Fulminus, not only narratively was it so amazing, but I also liked the mechanics. The moon mechanic in particular I thought was really, really cool, where you can't be on the dark side of it too long or the light side of it too long because it's an insta-kill. I really liked that. For some reason, when I think like to all the mechanics in all the engagements during Stormblood, that's the one that's most memorable to me, and it's such a simple mechanic, but I don't know, something about it just I really, really liked, and a variation of that would I think would be cool to experiment with different bosses and trials in the future. But I really liked that mechanic. It's one of those things where you want to replay like a harder difficulty version of that trial or of that dungeon. Just as an example. But it's one of those examples where there's a mechanic that's kind of fun to go through and to kind of try and balance the scales, if you will. I don't know, something about that is kind of fun, and you don't really I get pissed when you die from it, but it's one of those things you want to overcome. That's what I'm trying to say. So yeah, that's probably the most memorable out of all dungeons and trials. I gotta say the most memorable one, other than the wrap up with at the end of 4.0 with Xenos and fighting him in the Shinryu Xenos form. I'd say Castrum Fluminus is probably the most memorable trial / dungeon in all of Stormblood. And ironically, again, to continue the trend, it's all in the post 4.0 content. Yeah. So yeah, I would say numerically I would rate the trials and dungeons in Stormblood overall. I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Very, very good. Not as many memorable or fun ones as Heaven's Ward, or even I would even say A Realm Reborn had a few more memorable, more impactful trials and dungeons. But I would say that it's still very solid. Mechanically, they were all very sound. There was a lot of creative work, both aesthetically and mechanically throughout. It's just they needed to do more to make some of them more memorable, I thought. There is one other one I will mention. I can't remember the name of it though, so I can't really think you can call it memorable. But it's when we were traveling to Kugane with the pirates, and then we were besieged. When we were basically got the boat dragged off, and we had to have like this kind of like pirate horror section. kind of like Halloween kind of feel. That dungeon was really fun, and it hit all the aesthetic marks that I really love, and I thought that one was really fun. It felt random narratively, but I didn't care. It was just a fun dungeon, I think, both aesthetically and mechanically. So that's the only other one that's memorable, but it's hard to say that because I don't remember the name of it. So yeah, that's the only other one I'll note. But yeah, overall, Dungeons Trials 8 out of 10, very good mechanically. Just feel narratively and aesthetically there could have been more done to really pop more of them out of the slog of the rest of them. This section wasn't originally going to be in the core review of Stormblood, mainly because I wasn't planning on doing the Omega raids until after Shadowbringers. The reason for that was 99% of people I asked told me that the Omega raid story was not applicable or necessary, needed, mind you, to understand any of Shadowbringers. So, with that understanding and knowing it was necessary for Endwalker, as I know the writer for Endwalker, I believe, has stated that the Omega raids are actually very crucial to understanding certain points in Endwalker, but for Shadowbringers, it wasn't necessary. At least 5.0, I was told. So, I was going to skip it, but I had one very stubborn, kind of rude, but one very stubborn viewer on the streams kind of demanding that I play through the Omega raids, and I thought, what the hell, they're probably going to be really fun, and there's not a big problem with it doing it earlier. I fit it all in one stream, although I almost didn't, because apparently Omega hacked my internet connection, was like, no, you're not going to finish off this fight today. So, thankfully I was able to circumvent that and make it through and finish Omega in one day, and I gotta say, the raids were a lot of fun. I liked the narrative. Will it be applicable, and will it be something I needed to experience before finishing up Shadowbringers? I don't know. As of right now, I haven't experienced anything whatsoever in Shadowbringers that calls back to either Alexander, which I have done as well, or Omega, but we'll see. That being said, with the Omega raids themselves, they were a lot of fun. Alpha, oh my god, best, cutest little character in the entirety of the game, and I will not hear otherwise. No Lalafell is as adorable as this little bird. I'm sorry, it is not debatable. I loved the story that unfolded with Omega. The arc with Alpha, the kind of really dark side of it where Omega revealed that it had done countless experiments with different forms of Alpha, and the feathers falling down, and the insinuation that each feather represents a failed experiment or a failed subject of Alpha. So it's like each of these feathers represents one that he's essentially killed. It's pretty fucking dark. And also the overall story, learning about Omega and how it came from another world. A lot of the story beats that were in it, like Omega coming from another world and not being built by the Allagans. I still say Allagan, but I think it's Allagan. The Allagan Empire. That was a pretty big reveal. I was like, oh my god, wow. So Omega's not even Allagan technology. It was made somewhere else, and it traversed the stars and hunted down Midgard's Swarmer. Now the reveal that the dragons weren't from Eorzea wasn't a surprise, because that was actually revealed forever ago now. When the first time we faced Midgard's Swarmer forever ago again, he's mentioned coming to this star with his brood, which told me either one, he just appeared etherically and actually appeared on the planet, or he traveled to it. And I believe there's dialogue in Heavensward that when he speaks to his daughter of one of his brood, who's trapped in Allagan technology in those rings, that for me, like the dialogue there revealed that they were definitively from a different planet, like a different world out in the stars and out in the ether of the void of space. I thought was pretty solidly established, so that's, in my opinion, nothing new. I suppose the absolute definitive hammering of the nail in the coffin of that lore detail, I suppose, was good to have, but more or less at the weakest it's been highly insinuated, and at the strongest it's been downright established before. So that wasn't anything new to me. I did think it was cool to learn more about Midgard Swarmer and to kind of fight him. Technically, it's hard to say, like, did we actually fight him, or what was that shade that Omega conjured? Even Omega said that shade wasn't as strong as Midgard Swarmer was in his prime, but was close, or closer than his current form was, the one we travel with. So I don't know, but it was cool to face off with with Midgard Swarmer in his prime, in a sense, and also when we eventually came to face Omega himself, or herself, or Omega itself. Like, there's so many memorable ones too. We also got to fight Kefka, which I've only ever played Final Fantasy Final Fantasy VII, and I know Kefka is from Final Fantasy VI, so I didn't know. My friend has ranted about Kefka before, so that was interesting. The different characters we got to face off with, who were what appeared to be all callbacks from previous Final Fantasies, which was really cool, and I like the continuous love letters that are mixed or put into Final Fantasy XIV to the rest of the franchise. Even if I don't recognize all of them, it's really fun to see chat recognize them and be like, oh my god, that's from Final Fantasy VI, this is from Final Fantasy V, that's from Final Fantasy... You know, it's kind of fun to just glance at chat and see people, like, getting excited over that stuff. And it makes me excited because I'm planning on playing through all the Final Fantasies right now. I'm playing through Final Fantasy 1, and I know 1 through 3 don't have a lot of narrative. But anyway, when it comes to the Omega raids, I liked the overall story. I liked the narrative beats that we got to experience. Again, in terms of new information gleaned, there's not a lot of new stuff we learned. We learned, again, more about Omega, learned more about dragons and their nature. But overall, I guess the nature of Ether also got a little bit more discussed, I guess. Got brought up a tad bit more. But I'm trying to think of, like, anything, like, really, like, revolutionary we learned in Omega, and overall, I can't really think of anything. Nothing revolutionary comes to mind when it comes to Omega, in terms of, like, the story or the greater lore of the universe we learned. Again, other than Omega and the dragons were from a different world, but also, again, that has been established before now. Well, not Omega being from a different one, but definitely Midgard Swarmer and his brood coming from elsewhere. That was already set in stone, I thought. So I don't know. I did enjoy the raids. They were a lot of fun. Mechanically, there was a lot of fun mechanics, I thought, facing off against each boss. And I do like that there was basically no dungeon runs. There was duties you had to do between each wing of the raids. So there's 4 bosses each. There's 3 wings, 4 bosses each. And 2 of them at the very end are Omega. So I would say that I liked that trial setup more than I liked, like, the dungeon build up through bosses. It felt like a better system for the raids. I enjoyed it a lot more anyway. Just going straight to fighting each boss and focusing on boss fights as opposed to fighting through all the trash mobs to get to the final boss. I don't know. I like that a lot more. I like the trials. It felt more like a tournament almost. Like I was fighting in it. It was basically what it was. It was a tournament that Omega set up to face off against the most powerful being. I don't know. I had a lot of fun with them. I have no idea how to phrase that overall. So yeah, the Omega raids were fantastic. I liked the story in them. Alpha's best boy, his best little birdie boy. He's the best burb. And, yeah, numerically, I'd say the Omega raids are 9 out of 10. 10 out of 10, almost. But 9 out of 10 for me. I really like the Omega raids. Fun narrative. And really, really interesting dialogue. And, yeah, everyone should play the Omega. Everyone should play Omega, Alexander. Everyone has to play Crystal Tower. And the Coils of Bahamut. Like, those are all such amazing experiences, both narratively and, again, mechanically. So I think everyone should play those. But Omega, as it stands amongst the throng of raids in the game, I'd say is easily a 9 out of 10. I really liked the Omega raids. So overall, that is my thoughts on the Stormblood expansion of Final Fantasy XIV. I had a lot of fun playing through it. Again, though, looking back, the narrative had plenty of its own problems. The biggest hurt on it, obviously, being, again, it following up Heaven's Ward. That didn't help it at all. But overall, the whole package, still very solid. One of the best expansions I've played in any MMORPG I've played in the last 10 years. So that's definitely, that's not a hard achievement to do if we're looking at WoW, but it's really good. Again, it's just some of the individual elements really needed a little bit more polish. Narratively, mostly. Mechanically, everything was incredibly well done and smooth. But yeah, I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. I loved it. I would say numerically, if I had to rate out of 10 the overall, like, what is my thoughts on the entire expansion, I'd say the entire expansion is a 7 or 8 out of 10. I'm leaning more towards 8 out of 10, so we'll just go with that. 8 out of 10 overall, especially if we're including the post-Stormblood patches in that. Definitely an 8 out of 10. Really enjoyed it, and it's a lot of fun. It just needed a little bit more for certain things, and the overall plot needed a little bit of a more unique feel if we're gonna do the Asmogan and Doma kind of reflection of each other's rebellions. That needed to be handled differently, I think, but I enjoyed it. It was good, and especially the setup for Shadowbringers post Stormblood content, fucking amazing. Had a blast. I enjoyed it. I don't think it's a bad expansion. I think anyone who calls it a bad expansion has never experienced what actually constitutes as a bad expansion. And basically that's now my new parameter for establishing who's never played WoW. Is if someone calls Stormblood bad, I'm like, oh, so you've never played WoW. you never played World of Warcraft, have you? You think you know bad. You don't know bad. If that's what you consider bad, oh my god. You're in for a rude awakening. Anyway, I had fun. I enjoyed it, and I think everyone else will as well. So anyway, that's my thoughts. Catch you all later. Bye-bye. Remember to leave a like and subscribe.